Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. I am Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical. This week, I have recurring guest Chris Carlson. And so Chris is a former intel officer. He's a former naval officer. He's a sharp guy all around. So I'm going to start off, Chris, by asking you a question.
Only one?
Well, we'll get to other questions later, but we'll start off with this one. So using your powers of analysis, what do you think is the probability that I am speaking for my employer tonight?
I think it's 0.
You are correct, sir. Okay, I was watching old episodes, and I used to make a big deal out of that. Now I just sort of toss it out, but I used to make a big deal about not speaking for my employer and saying it that way. So I figured that
you have selective, as long as what you say is very paints the Air Force in a very good way. I'm sure they'll be right behind you.
Forget that he said that. Forget that he said that. I have no association, no official association with the military base that's literally.
There is no war embossing.
There is literally, I mean, I'm literally so close to the base that periodically the base yells at me. I'm actually closer to the front gate of the base right now than I am when I'm sitting in my cubicle. That having been said, I do not speak for any employer, past, present, or future, and I make a point of not doing that. Like nowadays, I will talk about the fact that I used to work for DIA, but when I was doing science fiction presentations at science fiction conventions, I always said, I always left that out. And like I was telling you that I did a thing for Peter Perla. When they're reading my bio, it says, and his current employer is redacted. How I always do that. So in any event, tonight we're here to talk about specifically, I put it down as Amphibious and Littoral, Interface and Orbital, Part 1. Today is really going to be some background stuff. And a lot of it sort of, one of the things about this show is I keep coming back to same topics over and over again, right? And part of it is I'm trying to sort of build this web of understanding, because I sort of view my audience as people that are interested in naval history and science fiction and sort of the mix of that stuff. People that might want to write about those topics, might want to write science fiction or something like that. And also people just like thinking about that stuff. And as I think about that stuff, I'm constantly sort of pulling things together and knitting threads together that I didn't previously have knitted together. And so there's a lot of stuff that everybody's seen here. In fact, almost everything in here you've seen at least one version of before for tonight. Next week is going to be, or not next week, but when I do part 2, if hopefully we do part 2, it'll be a little bit different. But right now it's sort of setting the stage and building the foundation and going back to some stuff that I've talked about before, and doing a sort of beefed up version of it. So, but before we get to that, Chris, how have you been?
Busy. We're finishing up High Tide, 2nd edition.
So High Tide 2nd edition is the 1980s.
It's the high tide of the naval conflict of the Cold War turned hot. And from most of the scenarios run from 1984 to 1988, 89.
So it's Harpoon in the 1980s.
Yes.
So lots of F-14s.
No, and even more backfires.
And even more backfires. So that's a very, very interesting time period.
Yeah, in fact, in going through it, one of the things we had to correct is we talked about RORSAT, EORSAT satellite targeting capability that the Russians had.
Okay, so tell everybody who's not a naval analyst what those words mean.
RORSAT means Radar Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite, and EORSAT is ELINT Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite. The first one uses active radar. second one listened to the radar. And the Russians generated a system that hopefully they could shoot ships with it. Didn't kind of quite work out the way they wanted it to. But going through this, the Russians have launched the first replacement satellite called the Baen NKS, and it's a active and passive system, and it went up in 2021.
Okay. So the Russians are still thinking along those terms.
Yeah, and they need to. Their only problem is they can only still support a few satellites at a time.
Yeah.
I mean, and they are constrained, like most folks. I think the inclination is 67 degrees, so it doesn't help them. We're squatted in their backyard.
Yeah.
Because it just gets up to about, the Arctic Circle, and then it bye-bye. So it gets up to about Iceland, and that's about it.
Well, it'll give them some warning we're coming.
Well, yeah, and if you want to strike while we're still not in their backyard, that's great. Just not too sure what else they're going to use.
Yeah, and they don't have nearly as much stuff with legs as they used to.
No, they don't.
Maybe they can lumber a bear out at us or something.
Oh, goody.
It'll give us an ability to get a cheap kill.
So that's what we've been working on mostly, is that particular product, to get it done and get it out of here, because we're trying a forms product again, where we do all the data forms ahead of time. If this one does as well as the others have done, we probably will not do another one again. For all the angst and debate that we've had from people, you got to do more forms. They are the worst selling product we do, and they take just as much time as anything else.
Yeah, and this reminds me of a comment that was made by Chris Lawrence. Did you know Chris? He ran.
I've never met him, but I know he's in charge of the Dupuy Institute, or one of the high guys that are.
So I met him when he was running. He had a game store in the Roslyn Metro Mall called Planes, Trains, and Games. It started off as Roy's Hobbies, and then he bought it from Roy, and eventually he changed the name to Planes, Trains, and Games. And it during a time period when I didn't have a car and was riding the Metro every day, it was actually, I didn't even have to go outdoors. When I got to the Metro stop, I could go right up to the game store. So that actually worked well for me. But his comment, and it really has stuck with me all these years later, about how people will spend time to save ridiculously small amounts of money. He was talking about people that wouldn't just photocopy a form, but instead would erase it and use it again. It's like, time is your non-renewable resource. It's the only thing that you can't get back.
I believe the famous line is from Napoleon. Ask me for anything but time.
Yes. And so it's like, I would gladly buy a forms book. I would gladly buy a forms book if I was playing a game on a regular basis.
I don't understand it. They just don't sell.
So, and I bet they're a pain to put together.
They're actually worse than putting an annex together.
Yeah, the thing is, this strikes me as something that you could solve with software. You need something where you can just input the numbers. Somebody can input the numbers and it generates the form.
Yes. For that, you would need Microsoft and Adobe to agree to talk to each other.
Is that a problem?
Yes.
Neither of those products talks to themselves. So you have a fan and write.
Glad to hear it. Someone asked us, in terms of designing a game or designing a scenario set, what is the biggest thing that gets in our way, and it's order of battle and making sure we have the right assets for the scenario. Because so many ships go decades of their life, you have to specify for that scenario what its fit is. Now, we put that all in the remarks, okay? All of them. So that's a one-time deal. When you build a form, you not only have to install all those, the appropriate remarks, you have to remove all the other ones, and then you have to take out the old ones because it's a very time-specific piece of paper.
Yeah.
That just takes a lot of time to throw together.
Yeah, and you see that I mean, some of that's big stuff too. It's not just adding stuff on. Like when they took the Pearl Harbor battleships and, they didn't just put them back into commission. They took them into the yard and gave them all upgrades at the time. And I only learned recently that they removed the unarmored conning towers.
For a number of them, they had to.
Why did they have to?
Weight. That's a lot of weight up high.
Right. But I mean, okay. Yeah, you're right. So they traded off for other systems. Right. But I mean, so yeah, I knew that. But the other thing that they talked about doing this, I only found out about this when I was watching Ryan Zemansky doing one of the Battleship New Jersey videos on YouTube, and he was asked the question. He did a show on what he thought the Montanas would end up looking like if they had been built, and he said that he thought that the Navy probably would have ended up building them without the armored conning towers, because the Brits had already concluded two things. First of all, it's a lot of weight up high, and you could better use the weight doing something else. And the other thing is, if there are people inside the bell when the bell gets rung, they die anyway. They die from the bell being rung, and so it doesn't matter if they penetrate or not. You're inside the bell when the bell's rung. And
well, Russo-Japanese War, that's not true. A number of the Russian ships got tagged in the conning tower.
Okay, but that was 50 years earlier, 40 years earlier.
Yeah, but the armor wasn't as thick. Yeah, it was probably a common round full of black powder from the Japanese. But the thing is that some people would probably survive, but here's the point. You're incapacitated.
Yeah.
Con has shifted.
Yeah. And the thing is, if a shell passes through, so you're still going to have splinter protection, right? So it's not like you're totally unarmored, but so if a shell passes through the bridge and a heavy armored shell passes through the bridge when there are people there, a couple of people are going to have a really bad day, but there are other people that are probably going to walk away going, I got really lucky, right? Whereas if you're in the armored conning tower, you might wake up the next day if you're lucky, but you're definitely not walking away from it. So
there might be something wrong with your hearing.
Sorry, what? All right. So I should go ahead and launch the presentation. So let me go ahead and do that. And so this is going to be part one, where we talk about what it looks like, what terrestrial naval combat looks like, and sort of talk about whether that makes sense in a science fiction setting, in a space Navy setting. And then next week, we'll start talking specifically about comparing amphibious versus what I'm going to call interface combat, and littoral combat versus orbital combat, because I think that those are the matchups, right? I think the littoral, the equivalent of littoral is orbital. The equivalent of amphibious is, I would call interface. And so we'll talk, that'll be the next time. So a couple of quick scheduling things. So I think that there's a very good chance. It says probably for the 22nd of June. I think that really, really is probably. I'm almost willing to change that back to green. Next week, the plan is Peter Gold and I talking about the Merchant Marine. And then the plan for the 22nd of June is to do the part two of this one And then the plan for the 29th of June or the 6th of July, depending upon what I've got done, would be Robert Work in the LCS. Now, on the 21st of June, Friday the 21st, I'm going to be at the Origins Wargaming Convention doing aircraft carriers in space, a 2-hour version of it. Those of you who have been, steady watching the show have seen all the stuff that I've talked about, and I've pulled it all together into one 2-hour long presentation. So that's the plan for that. I'm also going to do what the US Navy taught me about Starfleet, the 2-hour version of that. So that's on Friday the 21st. Then on Monday, I leave to go to the Connections US Wargaming Conference in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, at the Army War College's Historical Center there. And then I come back from that on Friday. And if I've got a show in the can, when I leave on that Monday, I will then execute that show on Friday. If not, it'll get delayed a week. And so hopefully, Chris, you'll be able to come back for part 2 of this, which is scheduled to be on the 22nd. We can talk about that later. I've decided that I need to actually put together an actual production schedule. And nobody should get excited, because it's not like you're going to be able to look at it and see, in September, on the first week of September, Chris is going to do X, because that's not the purpose of the schedule. The purpose of the schedule is to sort of sequence research. But I expect that as topics pop up, they might slide in early. And I expect that as things happen, things that are going to move backwards. In fact, I'm explicitly not going to put it on a calendar. Because if you put it on a spreadsheet and something changes, you can just add a line or delete a line or something else adjusts, right? Whereas if you put it in a calendar, it's like, once again, I have to drag everything over 1 week to because everything's moving. So I'm going to do it in a spreadsheet. But I should be able, with big error bars, be able to say, this is what I've got sort of in the can, or this is what I'm thinking it's going to be. Still planning on doing shows on different ship types, still planning on doing, I've got a long list of things that I've got more research topics than I've got time to research. Let's put it that way. So, and as always, nothing I say should make you not enjoy something you currently enjoy, and, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, we are going to get along to doing the Exordium 2nd edition book read along. But as I've said previously, I don't want to do that until after I've got my Sea Powers draft into Chris and Larry, because I know that when I have every reason to think that when I put the hood up in Exordium, when I start rereading Exordium, it's going to make me want to sit down and work on the Exordium game some. And so I owe somebody else a game, so I'm going to do that first. Okay, so next here's what we're going to talk about tonight. And most of this stuff, if you look at it, is stuff that you've probably heard me talk about before. I'm going to do a little bit different version. I've added and subtracted and other stuff, but a lot of it's sort of familiar, well-worn territory, but it's setting the stage for part 2. The one thing that is new is the other elements of terrestrial naval warfare. And I've been wanting to sort of do this talk for a while. In the long run, I've got a plan to do a YouTube channel that is all scripted stuff with more effort put into the slides than I put in on the show, because usually I'm doing the slides the day of, and I just don't have the time to put as much effort into making the slides look nice as I would like. The more scripted version of the show I want to cover basically all the same sorts of topics, but stuff that's been vetted through you guys at least once. So you are my beta testers, and then I will take it and break it into nice right-sized chunks and do it on YouTube. Okay, let's see. And I changed the order of how I usually put this stuff. I usually don't start off with kill chains, but I decided that I want to start off with kill chains. So kill chain is just a sequence of steps necessary to hit a target, right? Simplest form is find, fix, finish, and or detect, track, classify, target. In fact, we're going to eventually get to the Chadwick observation from Star Cruiser, and so there's some question about whether, Chadwick left a few things out. He doesn't talk about detection at all, right? How can you target something when you haven't detected it? Kill chains have a tendency to show up in doctrine documents, and every different warfare area sort of thinks about the problem a little bit differently. So the one I'm most familiar with is from my days when I worked for the Navy, and that was the ASW kill chain, because I was an ASW specialist. But the thing that I actually kind of liked about the BMD kill chain is that they've got an explicit kill step, right? The others don't have an explicit kill step. It's just sort of assumed that when you do the attack or the engage that you will kill it. In BMD, killing a target's hard enough that they say that's worthy of putting in as a separate step. Now, what they don't have in that BMD kill chain, and I'll note my knowledge of what the BMD people called their kill chain is about 15 years old now. But what they didn't have was an assess stage. And I think the battle damage assessment at the end to sort of figure out, okay, did that attack work, et cetera, is an important step that not everybody talks about. So, Chris, any thoughts on this?
They're all pretty much, when you boil it down, they're all pretty much the same.
Yeah.
I think the Air Force assess is to determine kill or no kill.
Yeah.
So I think when BMD puts kill into their kill chain, I think it's more of an advertising approach than analytical.
Maybe. I do know from talking with the folks who came in, who were part of the class I took. I took a class on BMD as part of my master's program. And one of the recurring themes was just because you can see the target doesn't mean you can kill it. And so it's actually relatively hard to kill. It's also hard to see some of that stuff because people have this idea of this nice pristine missile out there. That's not what it looks like at all. It's shedding fuel, big globs of solid propellant, and it's, their parts falling off, et cetera, and it's a target-rich environment, especially if you're dealing with a radar. So it's actually a lot harder. The other thing that's worth pointing out, the ASW kill chain has this weird thing in there, the localized step. So what's that localized step about? The localized step is really sort of a historical artifact, and it has to do with the fact that you're using different systems to do a lot of these things, right? And a lot of your detection systems will tell you, yeah, it's kind of over there. But that doesn't mean that it tells you that it gives you targeting quality data in order to drop a weapon on it. And so that's, the really good thing about magnetic anomaly detection is, the bad thing about it is that it's insanely short ranged. The good thing about it is that it's insanely short ranged. So if you get a hit on your MAD detector, you are within weapons range. You are within weapons range.
But
yes,
was it a submarine?
True.
MAD in the Baltic is kind of like, forget it.
Well, yeah, there's parts of the world. The estimate is there's something like 3 million ships for some value of ship on the seafloor. And so a lot of those are made out of wood, but a lot of them are made out of steel or iron. And those are the ones that are going to set off your detectors. Now, presumably, though, the localization step comes after detect and track and identify. And at least in theory, you're not dropping weapons on prob subs. You're dropping weapons on cert subs, right? You've already classified it with a couple of different phenomenologies, and you're saying, I I can tell that's a Kilo 4 Bravo because I can hear the noises that a Kilo 4 Bravo makes. And so you've already identified it as your target, in theory, right? If you're actually shooting to kill, sometimes you're shooting to scare. But if you're actually shooting to kill.
If you want to, if you would like to see a really good book that goes into the absolute frustration of ASW, it's Mariano Soroni's Find Him and Bring Me His Hat.
Bring Me His Hat, yeah. Because
there's a page in there that show all the UK ASW attacks, by whom, date, time, all that. And then they go through and give you the prob sub, pos sub, cert sub thing. And out of that whole page of attacks, one was later determined to may have been valid.
Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. So my copy of that book is about 8 feet in that direction, but I have not read it yet. I did buy it at your recommendation.
Yeah, when you read it, just don't get frustrated because there's no way San Luis should have gone to sea.
Yeah.
Her entire fire control system was completely out of commission. They were firing on emergency presets, on torpedoes whose batteries had exceeded service life.
South American navies, it's all about panache.
Hey, most of the guys found out they were at war because there was a radio announcement.
Yeah. So it's amazing. You can go on YouTube and see photos of like South American navies doing what the US Navy calls div tax, which is short for division tactics, which has absolutely nothing to do with tactics. Div tax is about close order ship maneuvering. And it comes from the day when maneuvering individual ships like this was about tactics, but that's not the way it is anymore. But it shows them doing like close formation stuff that just will make, you'll just turn white watching the stuff that they're willing to do. And, that explains the collision that they caught on YouTube because somebody was showing off and they ran into each other. But I did get to see a Chilean submarine's periscopes one time. They were doing an exercise with us, and it was an observation thing for the lookouts, a familiarization. So I went out on deck and watched them cycling the periscopes, and the submarine was 300 feet away, maybe. It was pretty close, and it's cycling through all of its scopes so that the lookouts could see what they look like.
Now, mind you, of the South American navies, the Chilean submarine force is good.
Oh, yeah. Yes, they are. That was also the exercise. I'll tell the story some other time, but that was the exercise that started off with the blue on blue. We got our blue on blue out of the way 15 minutes into the exercise. So if we got time at the end, I'll tell that story. Oh, by the way, this illustration comes from a web comic called Outsider, and he has some essays that have the background of the comic, and so this is an illustration from one of those essays, and I really like this thing. I give the guy money every now and then. Okay, so here's an example from ASW. And it basically goes through all the different steps, and you'll notice how the sensor changes when you go from one thing to another thing, right? So detection is generally, it can be a big picture thing. You might get it off of something like Certash. You might get it off of a tactical towed array sonar, right? Or something like that. But it's not unusual for you, and especially since doctrine says that you need to classify on more than one phenomenology. So it's not unusual to get like a radar hit or something like that tells you that somebody's putting up a periscope. You might identify the submarine by analyzing the tonals and go, it's got lines here, 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 and here. That's a Kilo 4 Bravo. And then you might localize with a magnetic anomaly detector if you've got an airplane that has a working magnetic anomaly detector. And then you can drop the weapon, and at that point the submarine is dead, right? If you drop the weapon in the right place and it doesn't fall for the decoys and it detonates close enough to damage the submarine, then you might get a kill. And that process really can take time. It wasn't unusual for me to go to bed. I'd leave combat, go and hit my rack for 5 hours, come back in, and they're still prosecuting the target. So there's a little illustration on the right-hand side, and then there's an illustration there from the Hunt for Red October, which if you're looking at that illustration from the Hunt for Red October, you should be asking yourself one question. Why is the butler from the Nanny commanding an aircraft carrier?
Because he's also Moriarty.
Yes, he is. He's also Moriarty in Star Trek. I figured out that it was Moriarty. It took a while to realize that it's the butler from the Nanny, too. I can't remember his name, but he does good work. Any thoughts on ASW kill chains?
Well, you're bringing it actually, I think, from a surface ship perspective.
Yes, I am.
Because
with E3s and support.
Yeah, for submarines, detection is going to be off your own personal sensors. You might get a queuing, but you're not getting there in time. So your detect, usually for us, it's a towed array detection because very low frequency tonals go far. I mean, that's how we started doing this. I mean, with early generation LOFAR, we could see or hear, however you want to put it, a November 4,000 miles away, and we're picking it off of screw cavitation. So you're talking 10, 20 hertz. That goes a long way. So we detect normally off a towed array, and then it's a long, involved process, as you point out, because if he's really far away, how you localize is by doing target motion analysis, which depends on bearing rate. And if you're really far away, you get no bearing rate.
You're doing really long legs.
Really long legs, and go back and forth. But the thing is, if you can't generate bearing rate, then you end up pointing the target and you go fast for a little while. Kind of like, it's not exactly like a sprint and drift, but similar.
Yeah.
You go forward a little bit, slow down, and try to reacquire.
So let's talk about TMA for just a moment, target motion analysis, because this is one of those things. So I frequently say, and I haven't said it yet, but I will. I was gonna get to that point. When you're sort of like, part of the reason why I spend so much time talking about the real world stuff is because I want people to understand the real world stuff. So when they start filing off serial numbers to run it through the science fiction converter, that you end up with something that pops out the other side that makes sense, right? And so you have to have some understanding of how the real world works to know what does and does not, what should be filtered out by the science fiction converter when you get through. Target motion analysis is one of those interesting things that has to do with the fact that when you've got a passive sensor like sonar, you can make some assumptions about how loud the target is. But all you really know is I've got a decibel level and it's in that direction. And, tonal. So I may be able to, I can spot them easier. I may be able to do some identification because I'm hearing particular pieces of machinery, but you're not getting any range information per se. Now, there are clues. If you're the way that sound works in water, it is bent by pressure and salinity and some other things. So sound doesn't have a tendency to travel. You can have direct path, but it also has a tendency to curve through the water, and you can have this effect called convergence zones. So if you have an idea of how far apart the convergence zones are, think on the order of, say, 30 miles. You have an idea of how far apart the convergence zones are. You might be able to go, yeah, okay, I think I'm getting a target from a long distance away. Might be something much closer. It might be, is it a quiet target close? Is it a loud target far away, etc.? You're not quite sure until you do target motion analysis, which is, I'm listening, I've got my long tail behind me, I'm going on such and such a course, I know what my course is, and I know what the target is doing on my display, and then I change course or I move to a new location and I do the same thing, and eventually you draw enough lines on the chart from enough different directions and you can say, I think it's around here. What would you add to that, Chris?
I would disagree saying that we know a particular dB level. Throw that out. All we have is a bearing and a frequency. And the frequency may not be true frequency because we're both moving. And if you don't know he's closing or if he's opening, you don't know which way that is. No, is it a red Doppler shift? Is he a blue? You don't know. But you have something close to a base frequency, so you at least have an idea of what it might be.
Yeah.
Now, here's the problem. If you're holding, say, on a Soviet Victor 1, you could be holding a 50 hertz tonal. Wonderful. Everything in Europe except Brit SSNs have 50 hertz.
Yeah. You've narrowed it down to everything.
Yes. So that's the real problem is when you get a detection, all you really know is he's out that way somewhere. And it might be a target of interest. So yeah, this is one of those things where patience is absolutely required.
Yeah, and if you think about it, so somebody's probably out there saying, what possible relevance does this have to science fiction? My answer to that is read David Gerrold's Star Hunt, aka Yesterday's Children. Because that's exactly the sort of problem that the Roger Burlingham has in that book. This started off as a Star Trek script, and it got rejected by Roddenberry, so he turned it into a novel, which then got rejected by the readers because they didn't like the ending, and so he did a second edition of the novel that's 50% longer than the first edition of the novel, and what had been the ending of the novel now takes place 2/3 of the way through the book, and so he wrote a new ending. And that's been republished as Star Hunt. It's listed as like book 0 in the Voyage of the Star Wolf series because it's really kind of a precursor. It's his beta test of it in the same way that the Apocalypse Troll, if you read David Weber's Apocalypse Troll and you're an Honor Harrington fan, you go, boy, an awful lot of this sounds familiar.
Mm-hmm.
It's very familiar. You can see the ideas that he was playing with that he later then came out with in the novel. So it's the David Gerrold's novel is very much of a submarine type novel in that regard, and they're not getting distance information. They're just getting bearing and stuff like that. Okay, so let's see. Let me go on to the next slide. Okay, this is a quick thing about part of the kill chain is knowing your enemy, right? So we've talked a lot about knowing the tonals of an enemy submarine. But here's an example of why knowing your enemy is important when you're going through the kill chain. So this is obviously a scene from Independence Day. You're Will Smith, and you're flying in your F-18, and you're trying to shoot these things down. What's the problem you're going to run into, Chris?
Well, they're faster than you.
I got a missile. My missile's going to catch them. Let's just stipulate the missile can catch them.
Okay. Other than that force field, nothing.
No, there's a big problem. The big problem is that your weapon is going to think it's a decoy. because your weapon is designed to look at jet engines, right? Your weapon, you're close range, so you're going to Sidewinder, and it's got the anti-radar field. I forgot to talk about the anti-radar field, but it's got an anti-radar field, and so you're using your Sidewinder, you're using your IR missile, and your missile goes, you can't fool me, you're not a jet engine, because we've made our weapons, our smart weapons are very dumb in that they're not very flexible. They know what the target looks like. They're really good about rejecting things that aren't the target. Long gone are the days where a heat-seeking missile, it's just looking for the hot spot. That's not how they work anymore. And so the end result is, if you tried to shoot on one of these things, your weapon's going to go, yep, nope, no lock. I don't see a jet engine. There isn't a jet engine anywhere there. So, okay, okay, that's what's going on. There's some new feature in StreamYard that accidentally activated. So now I'm going to talk about history, hiding, and hydrodynamics. And this has to do with the fact that navies are a product of their environment. A lot of times science fiction doesn't fully appreciate that, and these are the reasons why navies are the way they are. A-R-E, that should be A-R-E. And so, like this ship, the ship in front of us right now, if you go and read the tech manual, there's a reason why it's shaped that way. There's a reason why there's that scallop. There's a reason why, having to do with warp dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. All those reasons are made up, right? It's fiction, but Rick Sternbach and Mike Okuda can point to all the design attributes and tell you why it is the way it is. It's not just like the USS Iowa with big rockets on the back, right? So it is the way it is. Okay, so for most of history, you really only had two general types of warships. You had whatever filled the battleship role, and then you had scouts and auxiliaries. So you had ships that did supporting work, carried the mail, stuff like that, but they weren't really intended to stand in the line of battle. Like you go to the Battle of Trafalgar, how many frigates fought at the Battle of Trafalgar? And the answer is 0. There were probably frigates there watching, but they weren't fighting because frigates didn't add anything to your capability. By the time the 20th century rolls around, and go back and look at the Lautenschlager and articles, I talked about Lautenschlager to the cows came home about a year or so ago. If you go back and you look at all that stuff, you understand about how escorts came about, and the difference between an escort and auxiliary is that an escort actually has a role in the battle. So the battleships are fighting and the escorts are also fighting. They are doing torpedo attacks. They are preventing torpedo attacks. They're doing a whole bunch of different stuff. And the things that fit in that escort role expanded over time as the weapons expanded over time. And so you started off, 1890, at that point, you've got surface combat. And by the time 1920 rolls around, 30 years later, you've got airplanes, you've got submarines. So you've got air and you've got subsurface, and you've got to take all that stuff into account. And you've got ship-killing weapons that can be carried by relatively small vessels. And when you add all that stuff up, it gets kind of complicated. But you end up with this new type of warship. And then you have the naval treaties getting in the way and sort of causing things to be weird. So it's also worth noting that not everything called a battleship is equal. If you look on the right-hand side, the ships that are circled with ellipses are the ships that are in that little chart. And I put a line at the Michigan. So the Michigan was the first U.S. dreadnought style battleship, all big gun battleship. And that line represents the length of the Michigan. And as you can see, the Michigan is just a little bit more than half the length of the Wisconsin. And it's less than a third the displacement of the Wisconsin, but they're both battleships. So, Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about scouts and auxiliaries, the frigates that you're referring to,
Mm-hmm.
they were purely scouting.
Yeah,
I mean,
frigate.
they were for the battle line. They were the scouting element because you're limited to visual horizon.
Yes, and you needed to go put eyes on something, and it's sort of funny what ends up happening in the modern era. And the modern era for me, for in this context, starts about 1900, right? In the modern era, the idea was that you would use cruisers and maybe battle cruisers to be your scouts, right? The entire idea, Beatty's out there as the scouting element for the Great Fleet. And there was a big deal about using cruisers as scouts, which was their traditional role. Frigates were the cruisers of their day. Cruiser was originally a term that was about the mission, not about the hardware. And frigates were optimized to be cruisers. And by the time World War II rolls around, at least in the daytime, most of your scouting is being done by airplanes.
Oh yeah.
And it's sort of funny because there was this entire mission for cruisers that went away. Wayne Hughes makes the observation that with the exception of mine layers and minesweepers, every other class of warship did not get assigned the mission that it was built for. I think he overstates that a smidge.
I think he does too.
Yeah. I mean, his point's worth taken seriously. So it's not that cruisers, for instance, were doing missions that nobody had conceived of the cruiser doing, but there was at least one major mission where it's like, we need these things to do X, and that's not what they ended up doing, right? Battleships spent a hell of a lot more time doing shore bombardment than they ever did firing at other ships. The U.S. Navy, middle and late in the war, the U.S. Navy would have loved to be able to shoot their battleships at the Japanese Navy. Early in the war, the Japanese would have loved to be able to shoot their battleships at the U.S. Navy. Both sides had an incentive structure to not let that happen until such a time as they had superiority in that field. And that's actually when you sort of go back and look at the history of naval warfare, that was always one of the issues with the battleships. Why would you fight? Right? Think of all the effort that Jellicoe put into trying to get the high seas fleet in a position where the Grand Fleet could kill it. It's hard to do because the range of the weapons was so short, relatively speaking. So, okay, so ships can hide in 4 different ways. You can hide behind the curve of the Earth, right? So ship A can't see ship B. That airplane can't see ship B either because the ship B is hiding behind the curve of the Earth. You can hide behind the interface barrier. The submarine and the airplane have a hard time seeing each other. Not totally impossible because the submarine can stick up stuff through the interface barrier and look around, maybe even have a radar, or at least have a radar warning receiver. The airplane can drop buoys down into the water and it can spot that periscope or that mast when it goes up. So it's not totally impossible, but you basically have to pierce the barrier. Surface ships have the advantage that since they're on the barrier, they can do both at the same time, but that also means that they're easily attacked by both. So there's an advantage and a disadvantage there. You can hide through the use of distance and space. You keep moving. You stay moving fast enough that the other guy can never really quite track you down in a useful way in time to get a weapon off at you. And the ocean is big, and your targeting, your search sensors and your targeting sensors generally have different fields of view. Now, as things get more and more automated and sensors can be called into play faster, this is potentially going away. It's harder than it used to be, but navies still have tricks up their sleeves. And then the last thing is that you can be quote unquote stealthy. And how all these things operate, it really sort of depends upon the nature of the media, right? It's air and water has dramatically different attributes, and those attributes sort of define how these systems perform.
The other thing you need to take into account is that air and water also degrade in certain circumstances your sensor's abilities.
Yeah.
If you've got rain, radar has a real hard time. Some frequencies more troublesome than others, but they have a harder time. If you have a storm, your sonar is, it's busy listening to all the stuff's twirling around in the water. So you have environmental issues that can affect your sensors and thus reduce your range that you can look. And that increases, at least for curvature to the Earth interface barrier, all those reasons get bigger. The other one that you don't see a lot of talking about, but I think you make a mention here, is geography.
Yeah.
Some platforms operate close to land, and that injects a lot of problems, both to radar, infrared, and sonar, because the ground is clutter.
Yeah.
And that competes with the signature of the platform.
We're going to talk about that when we talk about the littoral regions, right? You get close to ground, get close to the shore, you start having to deal with backdrop stuff, you start having to deal with the sea floor getting in the way. And by getting in the way, I mean, it changes sound propagation, it changes your ability to move fast, it potentially creates a situation where the other guy can drop mines in the water. You can mine in a wide variety of environments. Not as Chris, not as many environments as people think you can mine in, because if you've got a substantial current of any meaningful amount, it makes it much more difficult to mine. But all those factors play into things, and some of those I'm going to talk about. I was just making some notes here because there's a slide that I've got that I need to update a little bit with some of the thoughts you just you triggered a couple of thoughts in my mind. Okay, so let's talk about stealth in space for just a second. There's this belief that there is no stealth in space, right? You hear people say that all the time, and that's true to the degree that there's nothing to hide behind, and if you're warmer than the background, eventually something will find you. But it's a lot harder, it's more complicated than that, and it's based on a bunch of assumptions. It's based on the assumptions like sensors in the real world have noise in them. Your sensor only has a limited amount of sensitivity. And so the idea that you're going to be able to spot something that's 3 degrees above the cosmic microwave background, if it's more than 3 degrees, you're going to be able to spot it, is making some assumptions about what your sensors can do, especially when you're trying to deploy sensors in meaningful numbers.
I think one of the bigger things to point out is there may be a signature to detect, but it may not be different enough from the stellar background to recognize it as a target. So stealth goes beyond just detection.
Yep. It goes stealth. People think that stealth is invisibility, that it's a cloaking device. Stealth is just an adjustment of your signal to noise ratio. And so I always tell people, it's like, I can find any stealth aircraft out there. Put me in charge of the radar and I'll find it, right? And I'll go to the sensitivity knob, I'll crank it up to 11, and then I will turn to the people and say, one of the 5,000 dots that just appeared on the screen is the stealth aircraft you're looking for. All you have to do is figure out which dot it is. Make checks payable too. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And coming up with sensors that you can deploying the sensors is likely to be expensive. Stuff has to be maintained. It's in orbit, so that means there's issues with orbits, etc. It has to be in an orbit because otherwise it's falling into the local star. You have to have an understanding of the environment. The cosmic microwave background, they talk about it being 3 degrees for the cosmic microwave background. That's an average. It's different based upon which direction you point. You've got zodiacal dust that also emits in the infrared. So the closer you get to the star, the more junk you've got there. And so lots of opportunities for false targets. Oh, Chris went away. Hopefully he'll be back. And the other thing that people don't fully appreciate is we haven't even gotten into all the assumptions about your science fiction background yet, right? All this stuff takes time to do, and maybe I don't have the time to do that. If you talk about the Exordium series, for instance, they've got a tactically useful FTL drive, so people are jumping all over the place all the time. Welcome back.
I think we had a power spike go through in my.
Chris, I'm here. You're not alone this time.
See, the thing is, she says that she's here, but she's got her avatar up, so I can't tell if she's actually sitting at her chair.
Look, I am 3/4 of the time I am actually here. It's just I have my camera off so that, like, if I have to adjust things that are inappropriate for cameras.
I understand. I'm just telling you why I thought that maybe I should go ahead and jump on it. So I appreciate the fact that, yeah, she's giving me the thumbs up. I appreciate the fact that she's here and she backstops me. So at any event, I was saying that, what we talked about so far doesn't even get into the science fiction assumptions of the show, of whatever the background is, right? In the Exordium universe, you've got a tactically useful FTL drive with a cycle time measured in seconds. So yeah, if I got time to go through a kill chain, maybe I can get a shot off, but I usually don't have time to get through it. One of the things I love about Exordium is that it's Gunkata with spaceships. It's entirely all about Ramius. Ramius always turns to starboard at the bottom of the hour sort of deal. And so that means that that you're actually having to be very, very predictive about where the target's going to be, because if you are just following the target, if you're just following a standard kill chain, you will never get it. You have to be predictive about it. And if you go and you read, there's an Australian defense analyst named Peter Layton who wrote a very interesting monograph about fighting artificial intelligence battles. And he basically says, yeah, that's probably where we're going to have to go once AI is a big deal in this.
I would point out, Chris, that even today, targeting is about predicting where your target is going to be, not where it is. So even for anti-ship cruise missiles, homing torpedoes, if I shoot the bearing, I will miss.
Yeah, because the target's moving and your weapon's moving.
It's all gone. I mean, this has been the case since 1906 when Navy started to figure out, hey, I can shoot past 10,000 yards.
I got to lead the target.
Now I have to figure out what's his vector. Before it was, I see, therefore I may shoot. Now you have to figure out what the vector is and shoot at the vector.
Yeah. Yep. So the other thing about science fiction is frequently there's a lot of undocumented assumptions that can totally undercut your conclusions. And so I'm sort of agnostic on the entire. When somebody says there's no stealth in space, my response to that is, tell me what the rest of your universe looks like. And so if the idea is that I've got magic fusion torches that are, I come in, I jump into the system out beyond the orbit of Pluto, and it takes me 4 weeks to get to the inner system. Yeah, I'm willing to grant you there's no stealth in that universe. If I'm talking Exordium ships, or I'm talking, Star Wars ships that just pop out of hyperspace and they're within 2 planetary diameters, that's an entirely different situation, right? In that case, stealth doesn't matter because, you know, the guy just pops in and starts shooting at you.
Really?
So, okay, so hydrodynamics, this basically is just, I'm not going to belabor this too much. It just basically boils down to a long, thin ship is faster than a short, stubby ship. And all the quotes here, I'll let you read the quotes. The quotes all come from a book called Sacred Vessels. The U.S. Navy and the Cult of the Battleship is the subtitle. It's from a guy named Robert O'Connell. Do not buy this book. Every decent bit of information in the entire 213-page book is on this slide. Everything else in the book is garbage. And I say that as somebody who's been paid as a naval analyst for the majority of my working career. It's garbage. He does not understand the difference between dependent and independent variables. His conclusion is basically battleships were irrelevant because they had a hit rate of about 3 to 6% at the beginning of the battleship era, and then they had a hit rate of about 3 to 6% at the end of the battleship era. And he totally ignores the fact that the range that they got those hits at went from about 3,000 yards to about 20,000 yards. And so he does not understand what was the dependent and the independent variable in that equation. He just doesn't fundamentally understand it. So the upshot of this is the hydrodynamics piece is why ships have a top speed. It's also the reason why your car has a top speed, right? Why does your car not just continue accelerating? And the answer is wind resistance, et cetera, means that you eventually get to the point where the drag is high enough that your engine can't put out enough output. And if you try, you end up breaking your engine. So now that the political science and historian has finished talking, does the naval engineer have any thoughts on that?
Water is just, it's a cruel mistress. I mean, O'Connell quotes the one that we hear often of, the power proportional speed Q, if you're lucky.
Yeah.
Certain ships, after a point in their speed regime, that number actually goes up closer to a factor of 4. So, you need lots and lots and lots of power for a 1 knot increment. And that's a lot of volume. That's a lot of fuel, more volume. Well, you just run out of space. Now, one of Chris's favorite lines, and it'll probably come up again when we talk about LCS, is that you can't make the inside bigger than the outside. So that's why we are constrained. The shell says this is how much volume you have, and this is what you get to work with. And there's nothing more you can do about it. Yeah.
And this is also this entire idea, all the friction comes from the undersea portion of it, right? So you look at a Ticonderoga class cruiser, it looks like somebody took a barn and put it on a ship.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's got this big flat front to the superstructure. And you sort of look at it and go why didn't they streamline that? And the answer is that's not where the drag's coming from. You've got so much drag from the hull that all the drag that you're getting from the wind resistance on the superstructure is just, lost in the rounding error.
That's decimal dust.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So how do history and hydrodynamics play together? And it plays together in the form of the World War I era battleships versus battlecruisers debate. And so it has to do with how you trade off between the various factors of firepower and armor and guns, right? So in World War I, in the Dreadnought era that started with the HMS Dreadnought, the decision was made. It's okay, I'm going to have 2 different types of ships. One that optimizes for speed over armor and another one that optimizes for armor over speed. Now, as you can see, they sort of came from different areas. So dreadnought battle cruisers were really sort of the linear descendant of armored cruisers. With it's more. I'm painting with a very broad brush here. By the time you get to World War II, though, your engineering plant was pushing the ship about as fast as it could. There wasn't really any point in making the engineering plant any bigger, but my ships are still getting bigger. And so I might as well just put that into firepower and armor, right? And so what you end up happening is you had this split, and the technology necessitated this split early on that it no longer necessitated. And as a result, you end up with something like the Iowa class, which is arguably the reuniting of battleships and battle cruisers. It has a lot of the attributes of both. So now you still had some old ships from World War I, and that's because ships are capital goods, and the naval treaties really sort of distorted things. So they when the naval treaties come along and say your ship can only be a certain displacement, when you've got those sorts of limitations on, you end up doing stuff that doesn't make sense from a physical standpoint. You're doing it for political reasons, for arms control reasons. So there's some other factors at play here. But it's worth sort of all this stuff plays together in a very interesting way. And I'm sure that when I do a dedicated episode about battle cruisers, which I intend to, we'll get to talk about that some more. Okay, so we've got other elements of terrestrial warfare, and I should have talked about depth in here, and I'm going to redo this slide to add depth into it. But you've got nonlinear weapons effects at range that there's no analog to this in space, right? As you're shooting at longer range, you get more and more plunging fire, and that changes the angle of attack on the target based on range. And you can end up with situations where your guns are more effective at long range than they are at short range. Note, that is not about the ability to hit. That is just about your guns being more effective at range, right? If you get the hit, your weapon is more effective. There's no equivalent of that. And then you also, when you start getting plunging fire, you get things like shells that are designed to actually penetrate underneath the waterline. Which, if I remember correctly, the Japanese did that, didn't they?
Yeah, the Japanese, when they did the Tosa experiments, that was one of the battle cruisers that got chucked overboard because of the Washington Naval Treaty, and they were shooting at her. There were a number of underwater hits because shorts were having the shell curve up and hit. So they thought, hey, this is great. We can avoid hitting the armor at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's no, I can't think of an equivalent of that in space. There's just weirdnesses like that. You get altitude effects, right? When you're talking about airplanes, the atmosphere matters in that, you go higher, I can see a longer distance. My sensors have a greater range. I can do all that stuff. But then you end up with things like, I can go faster at altitude because there's less drag, right? Because altitude matters because your environment changes with altitude. And my maneuverability changes, and you end up with things like having to worry about accidentally breaking the speed of sound. The thing that people don't understand about the U-2 is the U-2 aircraft, the cruising speed of the U-2 was within 7 knots of the sound barrier at its maximum altitude. If it broke the sound barrier, the shock wave would rip the wings off. So you had a pilot that had to maintain that he had to go that fast, because if he didn't go that fast, he'd stall, he'd lose altitude, and he's trying to maintain maximum altitude. So you had a pilot who had to maintain his speed within a 7-knot range. And then they modified the U-2 to make it heavier I keep saying the U-tube, the U2 to make it heavier. And when they did that, that margin of error dropped to 4 knots. Now, I should add in some stuff here about the depth of the water making a difference too, because it affects things, and there's no equivalent of water depth out there. Unless you want to talk about gravity wells, and I'll draw some comparisons about that when we do part 2. Also, your attitude for an aircraft makes a difference in that your client, your aircraft performs differently based upon whether you're pointing it up or you're pointing it down. There's no equivalent of that in space, regardless of what Commander Devereaux says in this movie. That was the dumbest line in a problematic movie. Chris, thoughts?
No, that pretty much gets it.
Okay. We're getting close. We're almost done. In fact, I think this is the last slide, if I remember correctly. So
pretty close.
So this is, I've talked about this before. This is from the Star Cruiser design notes from Frank Chadwick. Now, Frank is a land guy who was doing what was really kind of a naval thing. And so Chris has pointed out to me that some of the things that he talks about as being targeting probably don't really count as targeting. I think he's more correct than he is wrong in terms of how to think about the problem, but I wouldn't necessarily use his vocabulary. But what he talks about here is that it's about hitting the target. That's probably a better way of saying it. It's about putting weapons on target. There are 2 ways that you can improve the chances of doing that. You can either make your fire more precise, or you can shoot more, increase the volume. You can make it more precise by figuring out where the enemy is, doing a better job of figuring out where the enemy is, by making your weapon performance more consistent. So like a flat trajectory makes it easier to hit something. Or you can just do better at aiming it. On the defensive side, you can decrease the precision of fire. You can make the other guy miss for some reason, or you can decrease the effects of the fire by like armoring. So, okay, he hits me, it doesn't make any difference, it just bounces off. So it's not as effective fire. And one of the things that I find interesting is that if you go back and you look at this presentation from Bob Work, who was he was a former Deputy Secretary of Defense. Before that, he was an Undersecretary of the Navy. Before that, he was at the Center for Security and Budgetary Assessment. And before that, he was a colonel in the Marine Corps. Bob Work makes essentially the same argument in this presentation. And if you type that into Google, you can find this presentation. He makes basically the same argument. Chris, any thoughts?
The big thing about targeting, as we said before, is figuring out where the target is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference between it and tracking. Tracking is past tense, where it was. Targeting is future tense. Where is it going to be? If you want to improve targeting, that's a sensor relationship, that's a fire control relationship. But it ties in directly into improving your chances of hit. Because if your sensors aren't great, or your combat system, fire control computers aren't that great, even with a smart weapon, you're not going to hit as often.
Mm-hmm.
So targeting is step 1. Step 2 is getting a weapon into the same location as the future position of the target. And then it's all about the weapon. Or if there's, as you say, a really smart one, or lots of dumb ones, but they occupy a greater volume. All those translate into damage effects on the target. So you just can't improve one and expect dramatic changes. There's going to have to be some harmony here.
Yes, I would agree. So I think that was indeed the last slide. So that's the end of part 1. So part 2 is going to look specifically more at the idea of what is the space equivalent of Amphibious and what is the space equivalent of Littoral, or Littoral, as people insist on calling it. But Littoral came about in the same way that data did, right? The word was pronounced data until Patrick Stewart decided to pronounce it data. And Patrick Stewart single-handedly changed the English language through his pronunciation of that word. And the littoral combat ships single-handedly changed the pronunciation of English by putting the word littoral in front of a bunch of people who didn't know how to pronounce it. All right, let me take a look through the questions real quick. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion down here between people, but there's not a whole lot aimed at me. Okay. Scrolling. Yeah, Rob Davidoff points out there was another constraint on the Iowa class, and that is that it had to fit through the Panama Canal.
Mm-hmm.
And the Montanas got rid of that restriction. Now, that's the way it's usually phrased, is that they were willing to just go around. That misses the fact that at the time when they started designing the Montana class, the plan was to widen the canal. They ended up not doing that for like 60 years. But the plan at the time was that they were going to widen the canal, and the Montana class would have fit through the new wider locks. And that takes me to the end. So, Chris, do you have any final thoughts before we declare victory?
We haven't even hit him yet. How can you declare victory?
That is a very good point. So, so Rob has the comment about that he's mused what the effect of finishing the canal widening might have had on carrier design, presumably during the war. That's a very interesting question also. I'm trying to remember whether could all the carriers fit through the canal?
During World War II?
Yeah.
Well, the Essex can. I haven't checked on the midways.
Yeah, I can't remember if they could or not.
But everything after that, no.
Yeah, they did. They just effectively. It's hard. Aircraft carriers are big. They're really, really, really big, and it's somewhat sobering when you think that like something the size of an aircraft carrier in our universe would be considered to be a relatively tiny ship in, say, the Honorverse.
Light cruiser. No, actually, destroyer. The Honorverse, Roland's in that.
Yeah, they're about that.
So you're talking a destroyer light cruiser in the Honorverse.
Yeah. So it's really kind of fascinating when you sort of think about all the different scale stuff there. So,
and when you get into when you start talking about ship design more, the nice thing about space is you're more concerned about structure and propulsion. You're not concerned about weight as much. So ships get really big.
Yeah, the problem you run into the same problem that buildings do, which is the bigger something gets, the more and more internal volume is taken up by structure, just in order to maintain the rigidity of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like in Star Trek, Sternbach and Okuda got around that with the structural integrity field, which is this way of magically plussing up. I can dial up the strength of the structural members, right? So whenever they would say something about, integrity at 95% or integrity at 40%, that's what they're talking about, is the structural integrity field is failing on the ship. And so you can end up with something that's big enough that it can't really maneuver, it can't really it can't really turn very well. The other thing is like, think about where the pivot point is on something that's like a mile long, right? So let's just assume I'm pivoting in the middle on something that's a mile long, and I'm at the nose. I'm at the end of a half-mile long seesaw. So what seems to be a relatively gentle turn, relatively gentle pivot from in the back, might be 20 G's to the poor guy who's stuck in the nose of this thing.
Well, then you're assuming that you're applying thrust from only one position. If you've got thrust being applied both forward and aft in opposite directions, you actually get a nice, the bigger thing you're getting into.
No, but it's still moving like that, right? You're still dealing with the fact that the tips of that thing are moving pretty fast, and what is just a few degrees per second turn, you make that lever long enough and you end up pulling 20 Gs. So this is one of the issues that traveler ships have, because they don't have a magic inertial dampening field of something like that. So that's why you end up with magic having to be, people sprinkle magic all throughout their science fiction, to prevent stuff like that from happening.
And in Traveler, your maximum maneuver drive is 6 Gs, which is, in comparison to everything else in the science fiction world, that's a Model T.
Yeah, and you can maybe argue that so I can't turn, if I've got something like that I'm using as my the equivalent of reaction control thrusters to pivot. If I've only got 6 Gs at the end of something that's a half-mile long, then I'm not turning very fast.
Nope.
I'm just gonna sort of creep way through it. In fact, that ends up being a plot point, if I remember correctly, in some of the early CJ Cherry stuff. There's a kilometer-long warship that just, they're always talking about how it handles like a pig. And I think, if I remember correctly, it eventually just kind of folds in two. It takes some damage and just kind of folds in two while maneuvering.
And, the Honorverse gets around that by having the wedge.
Yeah, the Honorverse.
And then the dump. So all that inertia gets dumped into hyperspace.
You can dump everything into hyperspace. You get around that in Star Trek by having the structural integrity field to stiffen the ship, and you also have all sorts of subspace dampeners, etc. In the Exordium universe, all the acceleration is through something called the G plane, which basically is a virtual G field. And so the way the ship accelerates and moves and stuff like that is all through forces that are acting upon the ship and all of its contents equally at the same time. Like at one point early on in book 1, they crash. There's a small ship and it crashes. And while the ship is holding together, they're just sitting there like they're in just a regular 1G field, but looking out through the view screen, they can see that the ship is like tumbling end over end. And it's just sort of because it came down hard and it's just sort of tumbling. And then eventually the G field goes, at which point they end up being very black and blue as a result of it. They end up surviving because they lost enough velocity due to decelerative tumbling early on that when the G field finally failed and they were actually subjected to it, it was survivable. So, but all right. I think we should declare victory. What do you think?
I will go with your recommendation.
All right. So with that in mind, thank you very much, everybody. And come back next week, and Peter Gold and I will talk about Merchant Marines. And the week after that, it'll be the second part of this talk. And if Chris is available, he's invited back. And if he's not available, I'll do it by myself. And so with that, have a good weekend, everybody. And thank you for spending your Saturday night with me.